Welcome to Relaxing Revenge Storytelling. I'm your host, and tonight's story is a real treat.
My name is Rosalind Pemberton. I'm 34 years old. On a Thursday evening in late March, I walked through my own front door carrying a bag of takeout Thai food and found 30 people standing in my living room beneath a canopy of pink balloons I had never purchased, never inflated, never hung. My sister Gemma stood in the center of the room beside a poster board propped on an easel, and on that poster board was a hand-drawn floor plan of my house, my bungalow, the one I bought at a foreclosure auction 6 years ago and rebuilt with my own two hands, and the rooms on that diagram had been relabeled. My office said nursery. My guest bedroom said baby suite. And before I could open my mouth, my mother Vivian, a woman who hadn't spoken to me for the better part of a decade, put her arm around my shoulder and announced to the crowd, "Rosalind has a gift for the baby. She's putting the nursery in her guest bedroom permanently." 30 people applauded, and what I found under the baby monitor on the gift table changed everything about that shower. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you to do something. If you're listening to this and you've ever walked into a room and realized that the people who were supposed to love you had already made decisions about your life without including you in the conversation, hit subscribe. Hit the like button. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from, because this channel exists for stories like this one. Stories about the moment you stop being what everyone else needs and start being what you owe yourself. I'm going to tell you everything. How they got in, how far they went, what I found, and exactly how I took my house back without raising my voice a single time. But to understand how 30 people ended up in my living room celebrating the erasure of everything I built, you have to go back about 4 months to the afternoon my sister called me crying and asked if she could stay a few weekends. I need you to understand what that house means to me, because if you don't understand that, nothing else in this story makes sense. I'm a licensed building inspector for the city of Charlotte, North Carolina. I've been doing it for 11 years. I started as a permit technician fresh out of community college, worked my way through the certification exams, and by 28, I was running residential inspections across 3 zip codes. I know load-bearing walls from partition walls by the sound they make when you knock on them. I know when a foundation is settling and when it's failing. I know what a house is supposed to look like from the inside out, every wire, every joist, every inch of copper pipe behind the drywall. And 6 years ago, when a 400 square foot bungalow in Plaza Midwood came up at a foreclosure auction with a cracked foundation and a roof that was 2 storms away from caving in, I was the only bidder who knew exactly what it would cost to fix and exactly how to do it. I bought that house for $87,000. I spent every weekend for 3 years restoring it. I filed every permit myself. I pulled every inspection myself through colleagues I trusted because I'd worked beside them for years. I drove every nail, hung every piece of drywall, laid every square foot of hardwood on my hands and knees after 50-hour inspection weeks. No contractor, no crew. Just me and YouTube tutorials and the kind of stubbornness that comes from growing up in a family where no one ever finished anything they started. That house appraised at $310,000 by the time I was done. It was paid off, no mortgage, no lien, no debt. It was the only thing I had ever owned that nobody gave me and nobody could claim they helped build. And that fact, that single, clean, undeniable fact, is exactly what made my family decide it belonged to them. Here's the thing about my family that you need to know, and I'm going to say it plainly because I've spent 20 years softening this story and I'm done. My parents divorced when I was 14 and Gemma was 7. When I say divorced, I don't mean they separated and co-parented. I mean they both left. My father, Don, moved to Fayetteville with a woman from his office and became a person who sent birthday cards with checks that bounced. My mother, Vivian, moved 40 minutes away and started a new life that included yoga retreats and book clubs and an apartment that had 1 bedroom because, and this is a direct quote, "The girls are old enough to figure things out." I was 14. Gemma was 7. I figured things out. I cooked Gemma's meals. I walked her to the bus stop. I braided her hair before school because she cried when it was tangled and there was no one else to untangle it. I went to her parent-teacher conferences when I was 16 years old, and the teachers looked at me with expressions I didn't understand then, but recognize now as pity. I co-signed Gemma's first apartment when she turned 18 because her credit was non-existent and mine was barely surviving. I was her mother in every way that counts, and when I say the guilt of that mothering role never released its grip, I mean that it became the architecture of who I was. Rosalind, the responsible one. Rosalind, who fixes things. Rosalind, who shows up. Rosalind, whose life exists in the negative space around other people's emergencies. So when Gemma called me in November, 7 months pregnant, crying about mold in her apartment and asking if she could stay with me a few weekends during her 3rd trimester, I didn't hesitate. The old reflex fired before I could think. Protect her. Fix it. Make it okay. I set up the guest room with fresh sheets and a pregnancy pillow I ordered that same afternoon. I bought ginger tea because she'd mentioned nausea. I told myself it was temporary, a few weekends, and I genuinely believed that because I needed to believe it. I needed to believe that this time, helping Gemma would have an end date. The first weekend became a full week. The full week became 2. And then one evening, I came home from an inspection in Huntersville and found 3 carloads of belongings stacked in my living room and Marcus, Gemma's boyfriend, backing his F-150 across my front lawn to unload a futon frame. Marcus is a man who communicates primarily through occupation of space. He parked his truck on my lawn and left it there. Engine oil bled into my driveway, dark stains spreading into the concrete I had pressure washed myself the previous spring. He left boots by the front door, jackets on every chair, a weight bench in my carport. When I asked Gemma about the timeline, about when the mold remediation in her apartment would be finished, she rubbed her belly and said the landlord was dragging his feet and could I just give her a little grace? She was growing a human being. And I said yes, because that's what I do. That's what I've always done. Then my mother appeared. Vivian, absent for the better part of a decade, materialized on my front porch one Saturday morning carrying a casserole dish and wearing the expression of a woman who had never left. She walked into my kitchen and started rearranging my cabinets. She moved my cast iron skillet to a lower shelf. She reorganized my spice rack. She told me my dish soap was too harsh for a household with a baby coming and replaced it with something organic that smelled like lavender and cost $11. She told my neighbor, Patricia, a woman I'd lived beside for 5 years, that she practically raised both girls in this house. Patricia looked at me over the fence later that day with an expression I recognized from those parent-teacher conferences. Pity. And my mother hugged me at the door when she left that evening. That hug was a handcuff. I started noticing things. Small things at first. The way my father's name came up in conversations Gemma had on the phone. The way Marcus and Vivian exchanged glances when I mentioned the guest room being temporary. Then my cousin Angela called me from Raleigh, and in the course of a normal conversation she said, "Your dad told Uncle Bill you offered to let Gemma live there permanently. He said the house was always meant for the family." I went still. I was standing in my own kitchen when she said it, and my hand was on the counter and I could feel the grain of the butcher block I had sanded and sealed myself, and the wood felt like the only real thing in the room. I asked Angela to repeat what she'd said. She did. I said, "That's not what happened." She said, "Okay," but her voice had the careful tone of someone who had already chosen a side. 2 weeks later, I would understand why Marcus changed those locks. That Tuesday, I just thought he was being territorial. That's what I told myself. Territorial. When I came home and found the back door fitted with a new deadbolt and my key useless in the lock, I knocked on my own back door and Marcus opened it, holding a sandwich, and said he did it for security for the baby. I'm a building inspector. I recognized the lock brand immediately. A Schlage B60N commercial grade requires a completely new key set. I no longer had a key to my own back door. I stood on my own porch looking at a man who had lived in my house for 6 weeks, who had not paid a single dollar of rent or a single cent toward a utility bill, and he was explaining to me why I couldn't access my own home through my own door. I smiled. I said, "Okay," and I went inside through the front and sat in my office, the room that would later appear on that poster board labeled nursery, and I stared at the wall I had hung myself, and I felt something I can only describe as the walls of my own house leaning inward. I found the email on a Wednesday. I was using the family laptop, the one Vivian had brought over and left in the kitchen, for recipes, and the browser was still logged into her email. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for a recipe she'd mentioned for sweet potato soup, but the search results pulled up an email thread and the subject line read, "Re-adding Gemma to deed, Pemberton property." Vivian had emailed a real estate attorney named Dale Whitfield asking about the process for adding Gemma to my deed since she's been contributing to the household. Gemma had contributed nothing, not a grocery run, not a light bill, not a roll of paper towels, and my mother was consulting a lawyer about putting her name on my house. I closed the laptop. I walked to the bathroom. I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bathtub and pressed my palms flat against my thighs and breathed. I stayed there for 20 minutes. When I came out, Gemma was in the kitchen heating up leftover pasta and humming a song I used to sing her when she was 7 and afraid of thunderstorms. And the sound of that melody coming from her mouth split something in me that I cannot name and have not yet repaired. Then came the shower. Thursday evening, pink balloons, 30 guests, a banner reading "Welcome Baby Elise," a gift table stacked with items registered at stores I had never visited. Gemma standing beside that poster board with the floor plan of my house redrawn to suit her life. My mother announcing my generosity to a room full of people who clapped and smiled and believed every word because why wouldn't they? Rosalind, the responsible one. Rosalind, who fixes things. Of course she would give up her office and her guest room. Of course she would. I smiled through the shower with my jaw clenched so tight I chipped a molar I didn't notice until the next morning. I shook hands. I accepted congratulations for a gift I'd never offered. I watched Marcus move through my house like he owned it, pointing out the walls he wanted to open up, telling Vivian's friend Denise about the contractor who could start next week. A contractor. For my house. For walls I hung with my own hands. And the phrase he used, the specific phrase, was, a guy who can open up that wall. And I filed it away in the part of my brain that catalogs violations, the part that knows when something is not up to code. I was gathering paper plates from the gift table when my hand brushed something hard beneath a wrapped baby monitor box. I pulled it out. It was a manila envelope. Inside was a quitclaim deed, predated, notarized, with a signature line that was supposed to be mine but wasn't my handwriting, wasn't my signature, wasn't anything I had ever written or authorized. The transfer language was clean, professional, the kind of language I've read 1,000 times on inspection documents. For and in consideration of $10 and other good and valuable consideration, the grantor hereby conveys and quitclaims to the Pemberton Family Trust my fully paid $310,000 bungalow, transferred into a trust controlled by Don and Vivian Pemberton. My hands went cold the moment I recognized the legal form. I am not exaggerating. The blood left my fingers and I could feel the document's weight change, or maybe it was my hands losing their ability to hold things, but I stood in my own living room surrounded by pink streamers and I held a piece of paper that said my parents had forged my signature to steal my house. I slid the deed back under the baby monitor. I picked up more paper plates. I threw them away. I said goodnight to the last guest. I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat and I did not start the engine. I sat there for 45 minutes. And in that silence, with the porch light of my bungalow casting a yellow rectangle on the lawn, Marcus's truck had rutted. The phrase that crystallized everything arrived whole and complete, like it had been waiting years for me to hear it. I spent 20 years being Gemma's mother, so our actual mother wouldn't have to. And the moment I built something that was only mine, all three of them decided it belonged to them. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not a scream, not a slam door. A woman sitting in a Honda Civic in her own driveway holding a truth she had always known but never said aloud. And in that silence, I stopped hoping things would change. I stopped looking for the version of this story where Gemma apologizes and Vivian means well and Dawn is just confused. I started thinking about locks, about county records, about the specific sequence of steps between where I was sitting and freedom. I am a building inspector. I know how structures work. I know what holds them up, and I know where they fail. And that night, sitting in my car, I began inspecting the structure of my own entrapment with the same methodical eye I bring to every house I walk through professionally. I mapped it. Financial. They had contributed nothing, but Vivian was building a paper trail to claim Gemma had. Legal. They had a forged deed. If that deed got filed before I acted, the fight to reclaim my own property would take months, maybe years, and cost money I would have to borrow against a house they were trying to take. Social. Every relative at that shower believed I had volunteered everything. If I evicted Gemma, I would be the aunt who threw a pregnant woman onto the street 8 weeks before her due date. Emotional. I had raised this woman. I had braided her hair. I had sung her through thunderstorms, and somewhere in the marrow of my identity was the belief that her safety was my responsibility, even when she was standing in my living room helping our parents steal my house. I started the car. I drove to a Waffle House on Central Avenue and ordered coffee and sat in a booth and began writing a list on the back of a napkin. What I needed, what I had to do before the baby arrived in 8 weeks because that due date was my deadline. Once the baby was born, the emotional leverage would multiply. Every action I took would be framed as harming a newborn. I had 8 weeks to dismantle a trap that my entire family had spent months building around me. The next morning, I went to work, and I did my job. I inspected a new construction site in Ballantyne. I flagged a load-bearing header that was undersized by 2 inches. I documented it with photographs, filed the correction notice, and moved on to the next house. And during my lunch break, I drove to the Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds and pulled my own property records. The quitclaim deed had not been filed. It was sitting under a baby monitor on my gift table, waiting for me to sign it or waiting for someone to file the forged version and hope I wouldn't notice until it was too late. The property was still in my name, clean title, no liens, no encumbrances. I photographed the record on my phone and saved it to a cloud folder I created that afternoon, a folder I named Crepe Myrtle after the tree in my backyard because I am a woman who learned to think in code long before I knew I was doing it. That afternoon, I called the contractor. His name was Ray Jessup, and I had actually crossed paths with him on inspections before. He was competent, licensed, and when I identified myself as Rosalind Pemberton and told him I was the owner of the property at my address, he went quiet on the phone for 5 seconds and then said, "Ma'am, I think you need to talk to a lawyer." He told me that a woman named Vivian Pemberton had called him 2 weeks prior, identified herself as the homeowner, and scheduled $22,000 in demolition work to begin the following month. Wall removals, doorway widenings, a bathroom conversion. She had described the project in detail. She had used my address. She had given him a deposit of $2,500 from a check I never wrote. Ray said he had found it odd that the homeowner hadn't been present for the walkthrough, but Vivian had explained that her daughter was busy with work and had authorized everything. I asked Ray if he had begun any work. He said no. I asked him if he would be willing to provide a written statement confirming who called him and what was requested. He paused. Then he said, "If what you're telling me is true, I was nearly an accessory to unauthorized construction on someone else's property. Yes, I will provide a statement." I saved Ray's contact information. I wrote the date and time of the call on a sticky note and pressed it to the inside cover of a notebook I kept in my work bag, a notebook that was beginning to fill with dates, times, and facts arranged in the orderly columns of a woman who has spent her career documenting what is and is not up to code. The unauthorized lock change was next. I knew it was a code violation. In Charlotte, altering the locks on a single owner-occupied residence without the owner's consent violates the city's property maintenance code. I photographed the new Schlage deadbolt on my back door, documented the date of installation based on my own records of when I'd last used that door, and filed a formal code complaint through my professional credentials. I did not file it as a homeowner filing a neighbor complaint. I filed it as a licensed building inspector documenting an observed violation at a residential address. The complaint went into the system clean, time-stamped, and backed by my professional license number. It was the kind of document that could not be dismissed as a family squabble. It was institutional. Over the next 3 days, I saved every text message Gemma and Marcus had sent me since moving in. I screenshotted the thread where Marcus told me he'd changed the lock for security. I screenshotted the thread where Gemma asked me to pick up prenatal vitamins because she didn't have gas money, a thread that documented message by message that she had paid for nothing during her time in my house. I saved the email Vivian had sent to the real estate attorney, the one about adding Gemma to my deed. I saved it 3 times, to my phone, to the cloud folder, and to a USB drive I purchased at the Walgreens on Commonwealth Avenue and kept in my work bag. The USB drive was small, dark blue, and it held the entire architecture of my family's fraud in 2.3 gigabytes. I had one more thing I needed, and it was the hardest thing to acquire because it wasn't a document or a photograph. It was permission. Permission from someone I trusted to tell me that what I was about to do was not monstrous. I had been seeing Dr. Anwar, a therapist in the Dilworth neighborhood, for about 2 years. She knew my family history. She knew about Gemma. She knew about the guilt. When I sat in her office that Wednesday and laid it out, all of it, the shower, the deed, the contractor, the lock, the emails, she listened the way she always does, with her hands folded and her expression professionally neutral. And when I finished, she said what she always said, "I can't tell you what to do with your family, Rosalind." I had expected that. I had prepared for it. I opened my work bag and pulled out the manila envelope and removed the quitclaim deed and placed it on the table between us. She picked it up. She read it. And the silence in that room changed texture. She put the deed down and she looked at me and she did not speak for 11 seconds. I counted. And then she said, "What you are describing is not a family disagreement. It is fraud, and you are allowed to protect yourself from people you love." I had not cried during any of this. Not at the shower, not in my car, not at the county office, but when Dr. Anwar said those words, something behind my sternum unlocked like a deadbolt turning, and I put my face in my hands and I wept with a sound that came from a place lower than my chest, lower than my stomach, somewhere in the foundation of who I was. And it lasted about 90 seconds, and then it stopped, and I wiped my face and I said, okay, I need a property attorney. Dr. Anwar gave me a name, Lorraine Pack, an attorney in South End who specialized in property fraud and title disputes. I called her that afternoon. I was in my car in the parking lot of a Lowe's because I had learned that the safest place to make phone calls my family couldn't hear was in parking lots of stores they would never visit. Lorraine listened to my situation with the practiced silence of someone who has heard similar stories before, and when I described the quitclaim deed, she asked 3 questions. Was the signature mine? Had the deed been filed? And did I have the original? The answers were no, no, and yes. She told me that forging a signature on a quitclaim deed was a Class H felony in North Carolina, punishable by up to 25 months of imprisonment. She told me that possession of the unfiled deed was significant because it meant the fraud had been prepared but not yet executed. She told me she could draft a cease and desist letter and a formal notice of trespass within 48 hours. I told her to do both. The next 6 days were the most exhausting of my life, and I have inspected houses with active termite damage in 100-degree heat, so I do not use that word lightly. I lived 2 lives simultaneously. In the visible life, I went to work, came home, sat at the dinner table with Gemma and Marcus, and on 2 occasions, Vivian, and I performed the role of Rosalind the responsible one with a precision that left me hollow. I laughed at Marcus's jokes. I asked Gemma about her doctor's appointments. I complimented Vivian's chicken casserole, and underneath that performance, in every spare moment, I was building the infrastructure of my exit. I use the word exit deliberately. I was not leaving my house. They were. The first almost caught moment came on a Saturday. I was in the bathroom with the door locked, reviewing Lorraine's draft cease and desist letter on my phone when Gemma knocked. Roz, are you okay in there? You've been in there a while. I locked my phone, opened the door, smiled, said I had a stomach thing, probably the Thai place on Thomas Street. She looked at me, and her eyes did that thing they used to do when she was 7 and trying to figure out if I was telling the truth about the thunder being far away. For a moment, the old tenderness surged, and I almost told her everything. Almost said, Gemma, I found the deed. I know what you're all doing. Just stop and we can figure this out. But I didn't, because I had already learned, through 20 years of being the one who fixes things, that telling Gemma the truth about a problem doesn't make her fix it. It makes her cry. And then I fix it while comforting her. So I said, definitely the Thai place. And I closed the bathroom door and pressed my back against it and breathed. The second almost caught moment was worse. It was a Tuesday evening, 4 days before my planned reclamation of the house, and Marcus came into the kitchen while I was at the table with my laptop. The cloud folder was open. The folder named Crepe Myrtle. I saw his reflection in the kitchen window as he walked up behind me, and I had approximately 1.5 seconds to close the tab and open something else. I opened a recipe blog. He leaned over my shoulder and said, "You cooking something?" And I said, "Trying to find a good lemon chicken." And my voice was steady, but my pulse was in my jaw. I could feel it, and I could feel the heat rising under my collar. And I smiled at him with a smile that used every muscle in my face and none of the ones in my heart. And he grunted and walked away and opened the refrigerator, and I sat there with my hands flat on the table and waited for the blood to return to my fingers. That was the closest anyone came to seeing the plan. 1.5 seconds between discovery and freedom. The villain charm offensive came on a Sunday. Vivian arrived with homemade blueberry muffins and a photo album she said she'd found in storage. It was pictures of me and Gemma as children. There was one of me at 15 holding Gemma on my hip, both of us squinting into the sun at a church picnic. Gemma was wearing a dress I had bought with babysitting money. Vivian pointed to that picture and said, "You were always such a good big sister. Gemma is so lucky to have you." And for one dangerous moment, I felt it. The warmth. The possibility that maybe I was wrong. Maybe this was just a family that was clumsy with boundaries. Maybe the deed was Dawn's idea alone, and Vivian didn't know, and Gemma was just scared and pregnant and reaching for the nearest anchor. And then I looked at the photo album spine and saw a price sticker from a thrift store in Cornelius, and I realized my mother had not found this album in storage. She had bought it to manufacture a moment. The warmth was weather, not climate. I ate a muffin. I said thank you. I added nothing to the cloud folder that day, but I added something to the architecture of my resolve. The days accelerated. Lorraine finalized the cease and desist. Ray Jessup signed his written statement. The code complaint was in the system. The property records were clean and photographed. The USB drive held every text, every email, every timestamp. I had been carrying it in my work bag for a week, and every morning when I picked up that bag, I felt the small rectangular weight of it against my hip, and it felt like a key. Not the brass one from the foreclosure auction, the one that no longer opened my back door, a different kind of key. The kind that opens the door you build yourself. I chose a Tuesday. Gemma had a prenatal appointment at 10. Marcus drove her. Vivian had a book club in Cornelius that started at 11 and ran until 2. The house would be empty for a minimum of 3 hours. I called into work. I had accumulated 87 hours of unused leave because I am the kind of person who never takes time off. And that fact, the fact that my reliability had been so absolute that no one questioned a single personal day, was the final tool in my kit. I called Leon, a locksmith I'd worked with on inspection jobs for years, a man who had changed locks on condemned properties for the city and knew me as a professional, not as a woman whose family had colonized her house. He arrived at 9:30 with a new deadbolt set. Schlage, same brand Marcus had used because I wanted the irony and because I wanted commercial grade. Leon changed both locks front and back in 40 minutes. He handed me 4 keys. I put one on the plain ring with my original brass foreclosure key, the scratched one that had opened this door the first day I owned it, the key that had stopped working the day Marcus decided my back door was his to secure. The brass key didn't open anything anymore, but it was the first thing that was ever only mine, and it stayed on the ring. I packed Gemma and Marcus's belongings. I did it carefully, deliberately, the way I would pack a house for an inspection closeout. Clothes folded, shoes paired, toiletries in Ziploc bags. Marcus's weight bench disassembled and wrapped in moving blankets I bought that morning from the U-Haul on Independence Boulevard. I labeled every box with a black Sharpie. Gemma, clothes. Marcus, kitchen items. Gemma, bathroom. I stacked them on the front porch, neatly, symmetrically, the way I stack inspection files at the end of a project. Orderly, complete, undeniable. 14 boxes in total. I counted them twice. The lavender dish soap Vivian had placed under my sink went into the last box. I put my original dish soap back. The smell of it, sharp and chemical and familiar, was the smell of my kitchen before anyone else decided how it should smell. On top of the boxes, I placed the certified letter from Lorraine Pack. It was 3 pages, printed on legal letterhead, and it stated in language I could recite from memory that any further attempt to alter the deed, access the property without the owner's written consent, or misrepresent ownership of the property at this address would result in immediate criminal referral to the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office for forgery, fraud, and trespass. It referenced the quitclaim deed by its document number. It referenced the unauthorized lock change by the code complaint number. It referenced Ray Jessup's statement by date and notarization. And then I did the thing that I had debated with myself for 3 days and decided was necessary not for cruelty but for clarity. I took the original forged quitclaim deed, the one I had found under the baby monitor, and I taped it to my front door, facing outward, where every neighbor walking past on the sidewalk, where Patricia next door, where the mailman, where anyone with eyes could see it. A legal document with a forged signature and transfer language attempting to steal a $310,000 house from the woman who built it. I taped it at eye level, centered, the way you would post a permit on a job site, because that's what it was. A permit. A public record of what had been attempted against me. The March wind pressed the document flat against the wood, and the forged signature, a version of my name written by a hand that was not mine, faced the street like a confession nailed to a church door. I stood on my porch and looked at the boxes and the letter and the deed on the door and the new locks gleaming in the midday light. The brass hardware caught the sun at the same angle as the old brass key on my ring, and for a moment, both pieces of metal held identical points of light, the old key and the new lock, the beginning and the reclamation. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Gemma. Appointment went great. Baby is measuring right on track. Picking up lunch? Want anything? I read the text. I looked at the exclamation point after great, and I thought about the version of me who would have responded with a heart emoji and a lunch order. That version was still in the room. She was standing right beside me, but she was not in charge anymore. I locked my phone. I went inside. I closed the front door. I turned the new deadbolt. The mechanism engaged with a solid, clean sound. The sound of a lock that was working exactly as it was designed to work, installed by a professional on the authorization of the legal owner. And I stood in my hallway in the house I built, and the silence was so complete that I could hear the mockingbird and the crepe myrtle outside the kitchen window, the one that had been nesting there since the year I moved in, and its song was the first sound I heard as a free woman in my own home. I want to tell you about that silence, because it is the thing I did not expect, the thing no one prepares you for when you reclaim something that was taken. I had prepared for anger, I had prepared for guilt, I had prepared for the cold logistical reality of locked doors and labeled boxes and legal letters. I had not prepared for the physical sensation of safety arriving in my body like a tide coming in. It started in my hands, they stopped trembling. I hadn't realized they'd been trembling for weeks until they stopped, and the stillness in my fingers was so foreign that I looked down at them the way you look at a stranger's hands. Then my shoulders dropped, literally dropped by what felt like 2 inches, releasing a tension I had been carrying so long it had become architectural, part of my frame, a permanent brace against the next demand, the next intrusion, the next person walking through my door with a claim on my space or my time or my identity. My breathing changed. I took a breath that went all the way to the bottom of my lungs, below the place where anxiety had built a floor, and it filled a space that hadn't held air in so long that it ached, the way a muscle aches when it stretches for the first time after years of contraction. I stood in my hallway and I breathed, and the air was mine, and the walls were mine, and the hardwood under my feet was mine, and the door behind me was locked with a key that only I held. The grain of the hardwood ran east to west beneath my shoes. The same boards I'd sanded on my knees 6 years ago, and I could feel each plank through my soles like a pulse. I walked through every room, not inspecting, not cataloging damage or listing repairs, just walking. I touched the doorframe of my office, the one the poster board had labeled nursery, and the wood was smooth under my fingertips, and the room was empty, and it was mine. I walked into the guest bedroom where Gemma's pregnancy pillow had lain for weeks, and the bed was stripped, and the closet was bare, and the window let in a column of March light that fell across the floor in a clean rectangle. And I stood in that light, and I closed my eyes, and I felt my heartbeat in my chest, slow and steady for the first time in months, the heartbeat of a woman standing in her own house with her own locks and her own silence. The closet smelled faintly of the vanilla body spray Gemma had worn since she was 16. I left the closet door open and cracked the window and let the March air take the scent out, slowly, without force. If you have ever loved someone so hard that they started to believe your sacrifices were their entitlements, you are not crazy and you are not cold for stopping. What would you have done with that deed in your hands? Gemma's call came at 1:47 p.m. I watched my phone ring on the kitchen counter, the screen lit up with her name and a photo I had taken 2 Christmases ago, her laughing with cranberry sauce on her chin. I did not pick it up. She called again at 1:52, again at 1:58. At 2:04, a text. Ross, why is our stuff on the porch? What is going on? At 2:11, a second text. The door's locked. I can't get in. Are you home? At 2:15, she called again. I watched the screen light up and dim, light up and dim. The phone vibrated against the granite countertop with a sound like a wasp trapped against glass. At 2:23, Marcus's number appeared. I did not answer. His text came at 2:26. Rosalind, open the door. Gemma's pregnant and you're locking her out. This is insane. I read the word insane, and I thought about the forged signature on the deed, the $22,000 in unauthorized demolition, the $2,500 deposit check written from an account that was not mine, and I considered which of us had a firmer claim on that word. I did not respond. At 2:34, I heard footsteps on the porch, heavy footsteps. Marcus's work boots on the boards I'd replaced myself, the boards I'd treated with weatherproofing sealant 2 summers ago. He tried the front door, the new deadbolt held. He tried it again, harder. I heard him grunt. Then his palm hit the door, flat and loud, a sound that traveled through the wood and into the hallway where I stood. Rosalind. His voice was a command, not a question, not a request. A command directed at a woman in her own house. I stood 6 feet from the door and I did not move. I did not flinch. I heard Gemma behind him, her voice thinner, higher. Marcus, stop. Don't. He hit the door once more. The deadbolt held. Leon had installed it properly. The strike plate was seated in solid wood, not the hollow jamb that most residential doors use. I had specified that when I rebuilt the frame. I am a building inspector. I know what holds. They left the porch at 2:41. I heard the truck start. The engine sound I had memorized over weeks of monitoring Marcus's comings and goings faded down the street and turned left toward Central Avenue, and then there was nothing but the mockingbird and the refrigerator hum and the sound of my own breathing in my own hallway. Vivian called at 3:15. Her voicemail was 47 seconds long. Her voice carried the specific tone she uses when she's performing concern for an audience, even when the audience is a voicemail box. Rosalind, sweetheart. Gemma just called me hysterical. I don't know what's happening, but we need to sit down as a family and discuss this like adults. I'm coming over. She came over. I watched through the kitchen window as she walked up to the porch, read the letter, and then saw the deed taped to the door. She stood still for approximately 10 seconds. Her hand rose to her throat. She touched the collar of her blouse the way she used to touch it when I was a child, and she was about to explain why she couldn't stay for dinner. Then she reached for the deed and tried to remove it. The tape held. She pulled harder. The corner tore. She got most of it down, crumpled it in her hand, and looked around to see if anyone had seen her. Patricia was watering her garden 8 feet away. Patricia had already seen it. Patricia's garden hose was running, the water splashing against the pavers in a steady rhythm, and Patricia did not look away. Vivian shoved the crumpled deed into her purse, knocked on the door, and called my name 3 times. Rosalind. A pause. Rosalind, please. A longer pause. Rosalind, this is your mother. I stood in my kitchen 6 feet from the door and drank a glass of water and did not make a sound. The water was cold and clean, and I could feel it traveling down my throat and into my chest, and it was the simplest thing in the world, a glass of water in my own kitchen, and it was enough. Vivian stood on the porch for 4 more minutes. I could hear her breathing through the door, shallow and quick, the breathing of a woman recalculating. Then her heels clicked down the porch steps across the walkway, and her car door opened and closed, and the engine started, and she was gone. That evening, my phone accumulated 17 missed calls and 31 text messages. I read them all. I responded to none. The arc of those messages told the entire story of my family's power structure collapsing in real time. Gemma's messages went from confused, "Roz, please just talk to me," to hurt, "I can't believe you would do this to me right now, I'm 8 months pregnant," to angry, "You are just like mom, you know that? You pretend to care and then you abandon people." And that last one, I'll be honest, that one found its target. It hit the exact place she knew it would hit, the place where my identity as the one who never abandons, the one who always stays, the one who isn't Vivian, lives. I read it standing at my kitchen counter, and the words landed in my sternum like a fist, and my hand moved toward the phone to type a response, the old muscles firing, the old architecture activating. Fix it, explain, comfort her, make it okay. And for 1 dark minute in my kitchen, I considered opening the door. The old reflex fired. Fix it, comfort her, make it okay. But I looked at the counter where the crumpled napkin from the Waffle House still sat with my list and smeared ballpoint, and I looked at the new key on my ring beside the old brass one, and I stayed. I put the phone face down on the counter. The screen went dark against the granite. I left it there. Marcus's messages escalated differently. His went from demand, "Open this door, Rosalind," to threat, "I'm calling the cops, you can't lock a pregnant woman out of her home," to confused silence when presumably someone explained to him that it wasn't her home and never had been. His last text, sent at 6:12 p.m., was 4 words. "This isn't over, Rosalind." I saved it to the cloud folder. He did call the police. A Charlotte Mecklenburg officer arrived at 5:40 p.m. and knocked on my door, and I opened it. The first time I opened it since the lock change, and I showed him my deed, my ID, my property tax records, and Lorraine Pack's letter. He was young, maybe 26, and he read the letter carefully, moving his lips slightly over the legal language. He looked at the boxes on the porch. He asked if there was a lease agreement. I said no. He asked if any rent had been paid. I said no. He asked if there was a protective order in place. I said not yet. He nodded. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I had seen before on the faces of young inspectors encountering their first major violation, the look of someone processing the distance between what they expected to find and what they found. He went back to the porch and spoke to Marcus for several minutes, and I could hear fragments through the closed door, the officer's voice low and even, Marcus's voice rising and falling like a saw blade. Then Marcus picked up 2 boxes and carried them to his truck, and Gemma stood on my sidewalk with her hand on her belly and tears on her face, and I watched from the window, and the grief was a living thing in my chest, heavy and breathing, and I could see the late afternoon light catching the tears on her cheek. And she looked in that light exactly like the 7-year-old girl I used to carry on my hip. And the distance between who she had been and who she had become was the distance I had traveled to get to this window, this side of this locked door. I did not open the door. Dawn called the next morning. My father, the man who drafted the forged deed, called me from a number I didn't recognize because I had blocked his cell. His message was remarkable in its revisionism. Rosalind, your mother told me what happened, and I think there's been a misunderstanding. That paperwork was just exploratory. It wasn't meant to be final. We were just looking at options for the family. Let's sit down and talk about this. Exploratory. A forged signature was exploratory. A predated, notarized document transferring my property to a trust he controlled was just looking at options. I held the phone and listened to his voice. The same voice that had read me bedtime stories until I was 8. The voice that had explained on a Tuesday afternoon why he was putting his suitcases in the car and driving to Fayetteville, and I marveled at the instrument of that voice, how it could make the word exploratory sound reasonable, how it could coat fraud in the warm cadence of a concerned father. I saved the voicemail to the cloud folder. I did not call back. Over the next 2 weeks, the family structure that had been quietly leaning on me for 20 years tipped over under its own weight. Gemma and Marcus, unable to find anyone else willing to house them, moved into Vivian's one-bedroom rental in Cornelius. 3 adults in a one-bedroom apartment, the same size space Vivian had once deemed sufficient for 2 teenage girls. The symmetry was not lost on me. Vivian, whose casserole visits to my neighborhood had been a cornerstone of her image as a devoted mother, stopped coming around when 3 separate neighbors asked her directly about the forged deed they had seen taped to my door. Patricia asked her. Mr. Owens from across the street asked her. And Janet, 2 houses down, who was a retired paralegal, asked her in language that was apparently quite specific. Janet told me later that she had used the phrase uttering a forged instrument, which is the statutory term in North Carolina, and that Vivian's face had gone the color of old plaster. Vivian had no answers that didn't incriminate her. Dawn stopped returning calls from Dale Whitfield, the real estate attorney Vivian had originally consulted about adding Gemma to my deed. Whitfield, once he learned about the forged quitclaim, apparently wanted to understand who had notarized a fraudulent document, and Dawn, who had obtained the notarization from a friend who owed him a favor, found that the friend was no longer returning his calls either. The notary's commission was up for renewal in July. It would not be renewed. The web unraveled the way webs do when the central thread is cut, silently and completely. Aunt Cheryl called me once. She said she'd heard different versions and wanted my side. I told her the facts. The forged deed, the unauthorized contractor, the lock change, the deposit check I never wrote. She listened. I could hear her television in the background, the sound cutting out as she muted it midway through my second sentence. She said, I had no idea. I said, I know. She asked if there was anything she could do. I said, you can stop repeating the version where I volunteered everything. She went quiet, and in that quiet I heard the sound of a woman realizing she had been used as a broadcast tower for a lie she never questioned. She said, okay. That was the last conversation I had with any member of my extended family for 3 weeks. And in those 3 weeks, something remarkable happened in my house. Not remarkable in the way the world usually means, not dramatic or cinematic. Remarkable in the way a room changes when you remove the furniture that's been blocking the window. Light gets in. I woke up on my first Saturday alone, and the house was quiet. Not the tense quiet of a house where you're monitoring footsteps and interpreting door closings and tracking the sound of a truck engine that tells you Marcus is home and the air will shift. A different quiet. The quiet of a house where the only person's schedule you need to know is your own. I made coffee. I drank it standing at the kitchen counter, looking out the window at the crepe myrtle. The mockingbird was there. It had been there all winter, through the entire occupation of my home, singing its territorial song from the highest branch, and I had not heard it in months because there was always another sound between us. A television Marcus left on, Vivian's voice rearranging something, Gemma on the phone, the refrigerator opening and closing at hours I didn't choose. Now there was only the bird and the steam from my coffee and the cool March air coming through the window I had opened because I could, because it was my window. The steam from the mug curled upward and dissolved into the air above the sink, and I watched it the way you watch something you've been too busy to notice, with the slow attention of a person who has nowhere to be except exactly where she's standing. I repainted my office, not because it needed it, but because I wanted to. I chose a color called Still Water, a blue-gray that reminded me of the coast, and I rolled it onto the walls on a Sunday afternoon with the mockingbird singing and no one asking me when I'd be done or what I was doing or why I was wasting time on a room that was about to become a nursery. The roller made a soft, wet sound against the drywall, a sound I recognized from the original build, and the familiarity of it settled into my hands like muscle memory returning after a long absence. I hung my building inspection certificates back on the wall where they had been before Gemma's poster board replaced them. I put my desk back by the window. I sat in my chair and I looked at the room, and it was mine, and the blue-gray walls held the afternoon light the way a cupped hand holds water, gently, without squeezing. I signed up for a pottery class at a studio in Noda. I had been meaning to do it for 3 years, but there was always a reason not to. Gemma needed something. Work was busy, the house needed repairs. But on a Wednesday evening in April, I walked into a small studio that smelled like wet clay and wood shavings, and I sat at a wheel, and I put my hands on a lump of earth-colored clay, and the instructor said, "Just center it first. Everything starts with centering." And I pressed my thumbs into the clay and felt it yield under my hands, and I laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from the belly and surprises you, because the metaphor was so obvious it was almost offensive. And the woman next to me smiled and said, "First time?" And I said, "First time for a lot of things." I made a mug. It was lopsided and the handle was too thick, and the glaze came out a shade of green I hadn't intended, but I brought it home and I put it in my cabinet, and the next morning I drank my coffee from it. A mug I made with my own hands, in a house I built with my own hands. The coffee tasted the same as it always does, but the weight of the mug was different from any mug I'd ever held because I'd made it and no one had asked me to make it, and no one would claim they helped, and no one would tell anyone else that I had offered it. 6 weeks after the day I changed the locks, on a Saturday morning in May, I sat on my back porch with that lopsided green mug full of coffee, and I listened to the mockingbird and the crepe myrtle. The crepe myrtle was blooming early this year, white blossoms that caught the morning light and held it the way the still water paint held the afternoon. I thought about Gemma's baby Elise. She had been born 2 weeks prior. I knew because Angela had texted me a photo, unsolicited, and I had looked at the photo for a long time. A small face with Gemma's nose and eyes that hadn't decided their color yet. My niece, a child I might never hold. And the grief was real, sitting beside my coffee like a second guest on that porch, taking up space, breathing its own air. I did not push it away. I did not talk myself out of it. I sat with it the way you sit with anyone you've known a long time, without expectation, without negotiation, just presence. But here is what was different. The grief was mine. It was not a price I was paying for someone else's comfort. It was not the tax levied on me for having the audacity to protect what I built. It was clean grief, the kind that comes from a real loss, and it sat on my porch, and I could bear it because the porch was mine, the door behind me was mine, the quiet was mine. For the first time, in as long as I could remember, the sadness was not the cost of someone else's ease. I looked at the nail by the back door where I'd hung my original brass key from the foreclosure auction. The key was scratched, worn at the teeth from 6 years of use before Marcus made it obsolete. It didn't open anything anymore. The new deadbolts took the new keys. But I had hung the old brass key there on the day I changed the locks, and it had stayed there, catching light in the mornings, turning slowly when the breeze came through the screen door. It was the first thing that was ever only mine, and it hung on a nail in a house that was still only mine, and the breeze moved it gently, and the scratched brass caught the sun, and I drank my coffee, and the mockingbird sang, and I was not performing anything for anyone. I used to believe that love meant being needed. I was wrong. Love meant being needed, and the moment I was no longer convenient, that need became a blueprint for theft. I used to believe that family was something you held together by force of will, by showing up, by absorbing every cost so the structure wouldn't collapse. I was wrong about that too. The structure was never mine to hold. It was leaning on me, and when I stepped out from under it, it fell, and the sound it made was not my responsibility. If you're sitting somewhere right now, listening to this, and you recognize the architecture of what I described, the slow encroachment, the guilt that masquerades as love, the entitlement dressed up as family, I want you to know something. The logistics of freedom are simpler than the people who benefit from your entrapment want you to believe. A deed is a piece of paper. A lock is a mechanism. A boundary is a sentence. The hard part is not the execution. The hard part is the 11 seconds of silence before you give yourself permission. This story has been told. One scratched brass key on a plain ring, one forged deed taped to a front door, and one lopsided green mug made by hands that finally remembered they could build something just for themselves. If you've ever stayed in a house, a relationship, a role, a family that had stopped being yours long before you stopped holding it together, tell me in the comments. What was the moment you knew? Hit subscribe if this one